December 25th, 1991, Moscow. It's nearly 7 in the evening. Mikhail Gorbachev, head of one of the most powerful states in human history, sits behind his desk, ready to read his resignation on camera. Except the cameras aren't ready. The CNN crew is still running cable. Gorbachev sits at that desk for 45 minutes, waiting. Not like the leader of a superpower, but like a forgotten guest in a waiting room. It might be the single best image for what was actually happening. When the cameras finally rolled, Gorbachev read a short statement. He said, "The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics no longer existed." He said he'd accepted the decision with pain. Then he reached into his pocket for the pen he was supposed to sign the transfer document with, and it didn't work. A CNN correspondent handed him one from his own pocket. The head of the world's last communist superpower signed his resignation with a pen borrowed from an American news network. A few minutes later, above the Kremlin, the Soviet red flag, the hammer and sickle that had loomed over half the planet for 70 years, came down for the last time. In its place, the Russian tricolor went up. In that moment, no war, no bombs, no foreign invasion, an empire covering a sixth of the Earth's landmass, home to more than 280 million people, was wiped off the map. How is that even possible? How does a state with the Red Army, a nuclear arsenal, and a KGB whose reach extended into the heart of Washington collapse in a matter of years without a single shot fired? Was this collapse inevitable? And, more to the point, could anyone have stopped it? History is in the headlines, but the truth? That's hidden in the profiles. Welcome to Profile. Subscribe to join our community of curious minds. The Soviet Union was built on an audacious idea, the command economy. Markets, supply, demand, none of it meant anything here. Everything from the price of a loaf of bread in the remotest Siberian village to the number of buttons on a Moscow office worker's coat was decided by a single, sprawling body in the center called Gosplan, the State Planning Committee. The state decided how much of everything got made, how many cars, how many pairs of shoes, how many loaves of bread. It also decided how many of those things each person needed, what they should cost, and how much people should earn for making them. At first, the model worked like a miracle. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union went from a backward agricultural country to an industrial giant in 2 decades flat, a giant that beat Hitler and put the first human in space. But there was a fundamental flaw baked in. This engine had been built for war and heavy industry, not for ordinary people's daily lives. A story circulated among Soviet workers, passed by word of mouth, that captured the whole disaster of the command economy in one image. At a nail factory, so the story went, when the state set the quota by the number of nails produced, workers churned out millions of tiny, useless nails just to hit the count. When the state switched the metric to weight, the same factory started producing a handful of enormous, heavy nails that no carpenter on Earth could actually use. The system, in other words, wasn't rewarding productivity, it was rewarding obedience to a number. The result? Warehouses stacked with junk nobody wanted, and shelves empty of everything people actually needed. By the 1970s, the Soviet Union entered a period historians call zastoy, the stagnation. Leonid Brezhnev, who led the country from 1964 to 1982, 18 years in total, was a man obsessed with stability above all else. From the outside, the Soviet Union still looked like a superpower. Missiles, an army, the KGB. From the inside, the whole structure was quietly rotting. A senior Soviet official later wrote in his memoirs that during Politburo sessions, the highest decision-making body in the country, Brezhnev would sometimes read from prepared texts he clearly didn't understand himself. The men around him nodded along. Nobody said a word. In these same years, a stroke of pure luck bought the Soviet Union a few extra years of life: the 1973 oil crisis. As global oil prices quadrupled, a flood of petrodollars poured into the Kremlin. Instead of using that money to modernize the country's aging factories, Brezhnev spent it on two things: cheap bread subsidies to keep people quiet, and an ever larger Red Army. The numbers are staggering. While the US spent roughly 5 to 6% of its GDP on its military, the Soviet figure ran past 25%. The Eastern superpower fed its best engineering minds and half of its steel output straight into the belly of that military machine. They had the atomic bomb and couldn't build a refrigerator that lasted more than 2 years. Behind this show of military strength, a new class had quietly been born: the nomenklatura. Party elites who were supposed to embody socialist equality, but who functioned in practice as a red aristocracy. They had their own stores, fully equipped hospitals, and vacation dachas on the Black Sea coast, while ordinary workers waited months in line just to buy a pair of winter boots. The gap between what the party claimed and what actually sat on people's dinner tables grew so wide that faith in communist ideologies simply died out in most people's hearts. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was no longer an idealistic empire. It was an old polar bear, hooked on oil money, propped up on a cane of nuclear missiles, just waiting for one good shove to go down. And that shove came from a place nobody expected: the mountains of Afghanistan. In the late 1970s, the Kremlin still believed the Red Army was unbeatable. In December 1979, the aging men of the Communist Party's Politburo made the decision to invade Afghanistan. They figured they'd take Kabul in a few weeks and prop up a puppet government. 10 years later, the Red Army came home instead with 15,000 dead and thousands more wounded or maimed, its military pride buried somewhere in the Hindu Kush. Afghanistan wasn't just a military defeat. It was a financial sinkhole, swallowing millions of rubles every single day. But more painful than the money were the metal coffins. Soldiers who came home in sealed metal boxes earned a name in the Soviet Union: the Zinky Boys. The bodies were placed in heavy zinc coffins, welded shut at the seams. Families weren't allowed one last look at their sons' faces. The official reason was hygiene. Everyone understood the real reason was something else entirely. Those sealed coffins became a symbol of the Kremlin's cruelty and its habit of hiding the truth. Yet perhaps the greatest cost of Afghanistan wasn't measured in lives or rubles at all. It was the collapse of a story. For years, the state had told its citizens the Red Army could not lose. Now every coffin was shouting the opposite, that the party's propaganda had been a lie all along. A retired Soviet officer later put it plainly: "In Afghanistan, we learned that the system lies. That was the most important thing we learned there." But the lies weren't the whole problem. Corruption had worked its way down into the system's very bones. Corruption in the Soviet Union wasn't just money laundering or embezzlement the way it might be in a capitalist country. Here, it was a way of life. In a system where the official economy had gone lame, there was really only one way to actually get by: the black market. Ordinary Soviets had a word that was, in its own way, more famous than the Communist Party itself. Blot. Blot meant working your connections, calling in favors, greasing the right palm to get around the rules. If you needed a spare part for your car, if you were hunting for medicine your child couldn't do without, or even if you just wanted a decent theater ticket, your salary meant nothing. What mattered was who you knew. But that small-scale, everyday corruption was really just a shadow cast by something much bigger, flowing through the upper layers of power. The nomenklatura, the party elite, lived in a parallel universe entirely. While ordinary people stood in line just to buy onions, officials had access to hidden stores called Beryozka, stocked with caviar, Parisian perfume, and Scotch whiskey, all sold for next to nothing. It wasn't only the special shops. Officials also had fully equipped hospitals and even their own private lanes on the road. While workers in Moscow waited for hours for their beaten-up buses, tinted glass limousines tore past them in a dedicated center lane on Kutuzovsky Prospect, the government's own private highway lane, always kept clear. In the capital of a country whose founding slogan was equality, that permanently empty lane landed like a slap across the face. That naked contradiction did more damage to socialist morale than almost anything else. The Russian worker thought to himself, they tell us communism means equality, while they themselves live like the old czars. In southern republics like Uzbekistan and Azerbaijan, local officials were falsifying cotton production figures to collect bonuses. The scandal, later known as the Cotton Affair, showed just how deep corruption had burrowed into the party's deepest layers. Yuri Andropov, head of the KGB and briefly the Soviet Union's leader later on, reportedly told a closed-door meeting, "We don't know what's actually happening in our own country." Coming from the man running the most powerful intelligence service on Earth, that single sentence may be the most accurate summary of the Soviet Union in those years. Andropov tried to fight corruption with an iron fist and police discipline. He even sent KGB agents into movie theaters and public bathhouses to catch workers skipping their shifts. But he learned quickly that corruption wasn't a bug in the system. It was the system. Everything had been built on so many layers of lying that the moment anyone told the whole truth, the entire bureaucratic edifice would come down. All these wounds shared one thing in common. They were kept out of sight. Press censorship and a culture of covering things up had built one enormous bubble. Leaders in the Kremlin read reports that lower officials had faked just to tell them what they wanted to hear. Lower officials lied to their superiors, and superiors, in turn, lied to the people. By the early 1980s, the Kremlin looked less like the command center of the superpower and more like a nursing home. The Soviet Union had drifted into what historians call a gerontocracy. Its leaders were old men who hadn't moved from their seats of power in decades, and now their own biology was about to take a harsh revenge on the course of history. Moscow entered a stretch that people bitterly nicknamed the Parade of Grand Funerals. First, in 1982, Leonid Brezhnev died after 18 years in power. His successor, Yuri Andropov, the former KGB chief, lasted only 15 months before his kidneys gave out. After him came Konstantin Chernenko, 82 years old and so frail he could barely breathe without help from his aides. He too was gone within 13 months, in March 1985. When funeral music played on Radio Moscow for the third time in 3 years, the party's middle ranks had to face an unnerving truth. The empire was being buried alongside its own leaders. They understood, finally, that survival meant abandoning the old tradition of loyal old men. The system needed someone who could get through at least one full speech standing up before it was time for another funeral. It was out of this biological dead end that the name Mikhail Gorbachev came up. At 54, he was the youngest man in the Politburo. Unlike his predecessors, who'd been shaped in Stalin's era, Gorbachev belonged to a generation that had come of age during Khrushchev's thaw, the period when criticizing Stalin was allowed for the first time and the Soviet intelligentsia caught a rare breath of fresh air. He knew the system was sick. He believed he could still heal it from the inside. Gorbachev launched two flagship policies whose names would soon become famous around the world. The first was glasnost, openness or candor. For the first time, the Soviet press was allowed to write about corruption, about economic failures, about the crimes of the Stalin era. The newspaper Izvestia ran stories that 10 years earlier would have shipped their author straight off to Siberia. The second was perestroika, restructuring, a set of economic reforms meant to push the corrupt bureaucracy aside and make the system actually work. On paper, both policies made sense, but Gorbachev had underestimated one thing. Once you open a door that's been sealed shut for 70 years, you don't get to control what walks out of it. The first thing glasnost set loose was the truth, and the truth made people angry. Newspapers wrote about the Gulag labor camps, about the manufactured famine that had killed millions in Ukraine in the 1930s, the Holodomor. About the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact signed by the Soviets and the Nazis in 1939, carving up Poland between them. When people in the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, learned that their own annexation into the Soviet Union in 1940 had come straight out of that secret pact, their anger turned into an independence movement almost overnight. In Ukraine, in Georgia, in Armenia, the same story played out everywhere. Glasnost was supposed to fix the system. Instead, it dismantled the historical legitimacy the system had rested on. Perestroika didn't fare any better. Gorbachev's economic reforms weren't radical enough to build a real market economy and weren't conservative enough to keep the old system intact. Stuck in that limbo, the worst possible outcome happened. The Soviet economy fell into a chaos that could neither go backward nor move forward. While glasnost was opening people's eyes to the country's realities, and perestroika was emptying their kitchen tables, at 1:23 in the morning on April 26, 1986, something happened that broke the spine of public trust in the system more than anything else ever had.
There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened. The Soviet version is this.
In the dead of night, in Ukraine, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear plant exploded. And with it, the last remaining shreds of legitimacy of a superpower that had always claimed to be flawless turned into a lethal cloud of radioactive dust. Chernobyl was a perfect mirror of a system that had always chosen the lie over survival. A design flaw born from budget cuts, local officials covering things up out of fear of their superiors, a stream of falsified statistics. All of it converged at one horrifying point and blew up the empire's own nuclear heart. Gorbachev, the man preaching openness, didn't even know the full truth for 3 days. The bureaucracy had grown so addicted to lying that it didn't tell the truth even to its own leader. But the image that never left Russian and Ukrainian memory was the May Day parade in Kyiv just 5 days after the explosion. As radioactive dust rained down over the city, Communist Party officials, who already knew the scale of the disaster, quietly evacuated their own families, while sending thousands of children and workers out into the streets to march with red flags. All so the world would see that everything was under control. Chernobyl proved that, in the Soviet Union, Keeping up appearances mattered more than people's lives. Gorbachev later admitted that Chernobyl, perhaps more than any other single factor, was the real cause of the Soviet collapse. Because after that, no one, not even the most devoted communists, believed a word the state said anymore. Soviet citizens found themselves trapped in a strange paradox. They now had the freedom to criticize the government, but not enough soap to wash their hands. Television aired expose after expose, while the refrigerators at home sat empty. At this point, the Soviet Union tore itself in two from the inside. On one side, party hardliners, old guard communists, were convinced Gorbachev was a traitor and that order needed to be restored with an iron fist. On the other, nationalists in republics like Lithuania, Estonia, and Georgia used the new political openness to start murmuring about independence. Gorbachev was like a surgeon who'd opened the patient up, then lost his instruments mid-operation, while the bleeding refused to stop. Out of that chaos, a new figure stepped out of Gorbachev's shadow, a man who could smell power in the air, and who understood that reaching the top meant walking straight over the Soviet Union's corpse. Boris Yeltsin. By the late 1980s, Moscow was living through the strangest political arrangement in its history: dual power. On one side sat Mikhail Gorbachev, president of the Soviet Union, holed up in the Kremlin, trying to hold 15 shaky republics together through an endless web of treaties. On the other side, Boris Yeltsin, a former ally turned bitter enemy, had just been elected president of Russia itself. Yeltsin was a politician who read the street better than anyone around him. Pushed out of the circle of power by Gorbachev, he came back with a ruthless strategy. He realized he didn't need a coup to get rid of Gorbachev. All he needed was to pull the Soviet Union out from under his feet. If Russia, the biggest and richest member of the Union, declared independence, Gorbachev would become the leader of a country that no longer technically existed. On August 19, 1991, a date that would go down in history as the August coup, while Gorbachev was relaxing at his summer villa in Crimea, Communist Party hardliners and KGB leaders, terrified by the country's imminent collapse, made their last gamble. Early that morning, a delegation of 8 top Soviet officials, including the head of the KGB, the defense minister, and Gorbachev's own vice president, showed up at his villa. They told him to resign or declare a state of emergency himself. Gorbachev refused. The plotters cut his communications and placed him under house arrest. They rolled tanks into the streets of Moscow, declared a state of emergency, and announced that Gorbachev was ill and no longer fit to run the country. Instead of saving the Soviet Union, the coup signed its death warrant. In a moment that would become one of the defining images of the era, Yeltsin walked out of the parliament building, climbed on top of one of the plotters' own tanks, and called on the people to resist. In that instant, the entire world watched a real transfer of power take place. Red Army soldiers refused to open fire on their own people. The coup collapsed within 3 days. When Gorbachev returned to Moscow from house arrest in Crimea, he wasn't the same man anymore. He looked old, broken, out of step with the world around him. In a humiliating public session of the Russian parliament, broadcast live on television, Yeltsin forced him to read out a document showing that nearly every minister Gorbachev had trusted had known about the coup and betrayed him. Then, right in front of Gorbachev's stunned eyes, Yeltsin banned the Communist Party's activity on Russian soil altogether. It was history's greatest irony. The very Communist Party that Russia had given birth to was now declared illegal by the President of Russia. Gorbachev was still holding on to hope for a new Union treaty. He pictured turning the Soviet Union into something resembling the European Union. Yeltsin had a very different plan. He had no interest in sharing power with Gorbachev. He wanted to bury Lenin's legacy outright and crown himself the new Tsar of the Kremlin. On December 8, 1991, three men met at the government villa of Vyskuly, deep in the strategic Belovezha forest on the border between Belarus and Poland. Boris Yeltsin, President of Russia, Leonid Kravchuk, President of Ukraine, and Stanislav Shushkevich, President of Belarus. On the surface, it looked like a friendly hunting trip. In reality, they were drawing up the paperwork to end the Soviet Union. On that cold night, with vodka bottles reportedly on the table and all three leaders reportedly drunk, their advisors drafted a text that would shake the world. Their logic was simple. The Soviet Union had been founded in 1922 by Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. So those same three countries had every right to dissolve it. At 2 in the afternoon, they signed a document that opened with a single sentence. The USSR, as a subject of international law and a geopolitical reality, ceases to exist. But the strangest, maybe the most humiliating part of the whole story was how the news got delivered. The moment the ink was dry, Yeltsin didn't call Gorbachev, the actual Soviet leader. He called the White House instead. He told President George H.W. Bush, "Mr. President, today we signed the document ending the Soviet Union." A startled Bush asked, "Does Gorbachev know?" Yeltsin answered without missing a beat, "No, not yet." In Moscow, Gorbachev found out what had happened in the forest through Defense Ministry and intelligence reports. He was furious and called it an illegal coup and a betrayal of the people's cause. He tried to summon the military, but the generals had stopped answering his calls. Real power had already drained toward Yeltsin. The army, the police, even the treasury were now taking their orders from the Russian parliament building, not the Kremlin. 2 weeks later, on December 21st, leaders of 11 more republics gathered in Alma-Ata, Kazakhstan, and signed on to the agreement. Gorbachev had, for all practical purposes, become a king without a kingdom. And so, finally, the evening of December 25th, 1991, Gorbachev sits behind his desk, waiting for the CNN cameras. When he finally speaks, he says, "I am relinquishing my position with concern, but also with hope." He signs his resignation with a pen borrowed from an American journalist. The red flag comes down over the Kremlin. The lights in Gorbachev's office go dark, and Boris Yeltsin, who has been waiting next door, walks in to take over the office. The two men pass each other in a Kremlin corridor. Neither one says hello. So, what do you think about the fall of the Soviet Union? Was it a victim of Gorbachev's own mistakes, or was communism, by its very nature, doomed to fail in the modern world? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for watching all the way through. And if this kind of history speaks to you, subscribe to Profile for more. Until next time, stay curious.